2 years later, in a moment that would leave everyone stunned, the January wind howled through the streets of White Pine, Montana, carrying snowflakes that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. Ella Turner pulled her worn wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the empty street toward her small grocery store. At 42, she had spent enough winters in bear country to know the rules by heart, particularly the cardinal one. Never venture into the woods alone during winter, when hungry predators roam desperately for food. The morning light was just beginning to pierce through the heavy cloud cover, casting long shadows across the snow-laden ground. Ella's boots crunched against the fresh powder as she approached her store, the Pine Pantry, a modest establishment that had been her life for the past 15 years. The old building's faded green paint and slightly crooked sign told the story of countless Montana winters, each one leaving its mark like rings in a tree trunk. She was fumbling with her keys when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the typical morning chorus of the wilderness she had grown accustomed to. This was different, raw, primal, a sound of pure agony that cut through the frigid air like a knife. Ella se congeló, su llave suspendida a medio camino hacia la cerradura. The sound came again, more desperate this time, emanating from the dense forest that bordered the eastern edge of town. Every instinct, every lesson learned from 2 decades of living in bear country screamed at her to ignore it, to go inside and call the wildlife authorities. But something else, something deeper and more primitive, tugged at her conscience. "Hello!" she called out, her voice carrying across the empty street. Only the wind answered, whistling through the pine trees that gave the town its name. The cry came again, weaker this time, and Ella felt her heart constrict. Without conscious thought, she found herself moving toward the tree line, drawn by an inexplicable force she couldn't explain. The forest loomed before her, a maze of towering pines and snow-laden branches. Ella hesitated at its edge, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The smart thing would be to turn back, to call someone better equipped to handle whatever was causing that heart-wrenching sound. But Ella Turner had never been one to walk away from suffering. Whether human or animal, it was why she kept a stock of dog food in her store, even though it barely broke even. Why she fed the stray cats that sometimes showed up behind her building in the dead of winter. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the forest. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees under the dense canopy, and the silence was absolute, except for the occasional creak of branches heavy with snow.
Ella moved carefully, following the sound that had now become intermittent whimpers. She pushed through a thick stand of undergrowth, and suddenly, the source of the cries became clear. There, in a small clearing, lay one of the largest grizzly bears she had ever seen. The massive creature was caught in what appeared to be an illegal trap, its rear left leg mangled and bleeding. The sight made Ella's stomach turn. The bear's fur was matted with blood and ice, and its eyes, those incredible, intelligent eyes, were clouded with pain, but alert enough to fix upon her. The moment she entered the clearing, time seemed to stop as human and bear locked gazes. In that moment, something profound and inexplicable passed between them. Later, Ella would struggle to explain it to others, how she knew, beyond any doubt, that this wasn't going to be a story of human versus wild animal, but something far more extraordinary. The bear made no aggressive move, no threatening sound. Instead, it let out another whimper, softer this time, almost as if it were speaking directly to her. Ella felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she witnessed the creature's suffering. The trap was crude and brutal, its metal teeth buried deep in the bear's flesh. Blood stained the snow around it, creating a grotesque canvas of red on white. "Oh God," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "What have they done to you?" The rational part of Ella's mind screamed at her to retreat, to call the wildlife authorities and let them handle this. But she knew that in this weather, with the roads as treacherous as they were, help could take hours to arrive, hours the bear might not have. The amount of blood staining the snow was alarming, and the temperature was still dropping. "I'll be right back," she found herself saying to the bear, speaking in the same soft, steady voice she used with frightened stray animals. "Just hold on." The bear's eyes followed her as she backed away slowly. As she turned to hurry back to her store, she could have sworn she saw something in those eyes, not just pain, but understanding. The thought stayed with her as she rushed through the empty streets, her boots leaving desperate tracks in the fresh snow. Inside her store, Ella moved with purposeful urgency. She grabbed her emergency first aid kit, the large one she kept for serious situations, and stripped her freezer of every piece of meat she had. Into a large duffel bag went packages of frozen venison, beef, and pork. She added several thick blankets from the camping supplies section, her hands trembling as she worked. "This is insane," she muttered to herself, knowing full well that what she was about to do went against every safety protocol in bear country. But something deeper than reason was driving her now, a conviction that this moment was meant to be, that she was meant to help this magnificent creature. When she returned to the clearing, the bear was exactly where she'd left it. Its breathing had become more labored, creating small clouds of vapor in the freezing air. The sight steeled her resolve. "Okay," she breathed, setting her supplies down at a safe distance. "Let's do this." For the next several hours, Ella worked methodically, talking constantly in a low, soothing voice. She began by tossing pieces of meat toward the bear, watching as it sniffed them cautiously before eating. With each piece, she moved slightly closer, until she was within 10 feet of the massive animal. "That's it," she murmured, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm going to help you. Just stay calm." The trap was a brutal piece of engineering, its rusty jaws clamped firmly around the bear's leg. Ella's hatred for whoever had set it grew with each passing minute. Working with painstaking slowness, she examined the mechanism, looking for the release catch. The bear watched her every move, but remained remarkably still, only occasionally letting out a low moan of pain. When Ella finally found the release mechanism, she took a deep breath and looked directly into the bear's eyes. "This is going to hurt," she warned softly. "But it's the only way." With trembling hands, she triggered the release. The bear let out a roar that echoed through the trees, but remarkably, it didn't lash out. As soon as the trap fell away, Ella could see the full extent of the damage, deep puncture wounds and torn flesh that made her stomach lurch. Working as quickly as she dared, she cleaned the wounds with antiseptic from her first aid kit, apologizing repeatedly as the bear growled in pain. The creature's restraint was extraordinary. Despite its obvious agony, it seemed to understand that she was trying to help. By the time she finished bandaging the leg, the short winter day was fading into dusk. The temperature had dropped even further, and Ella's fingers were numb despite her gloves. She spread the blankets around the bear, creating a makeshift nest against the cold. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised, gathering her supplies. "Just rest now." As she turned to leave, the bear made a soft sound, not a growl or a roar, but something gentler. Ella looked back and found those intelligent eyes still watching her, and in them, she saw something that would stay with her forever: trust. That night, as she lay in her bed above the store, Ella couldn't sleep. The image of the bear's eyes haunted her, and she worried about infection setting in, about other predators finding it in its weakened state. She knew she had taken an incredible risk, but somehow, she also knew it had been the right thing to do. Outside, the Montana winter raged on, but in Ella's heart, a warm certainty had taken root. This was just the beginning of something extraordinary. For the next 5 days, Ella's life revolved around her secret patient in the forest. Each morning, she arrived at dawn with fresh bandages and meat, her heart pounding until she confirmed the bear was still alive. The creature's resilience amazed her. Despite its grievous injury, it maintained a quiet dignity that touched something deep in Ella's soul. Word had begun to spread around White Pine that something was different about Ella. Mrs. Henderson, who usually stopped by every morning for her daily newspaper, noticed the dark circles under Ella's eyes. Tommy Barnes, the local handyman, commented on her distracted manner when he came to fix a leaky pipe. "Everything all right, Ella?" he'd asked, concern evident in his weathered face. "You seem a bit off lately." "Just tired," she'd replied, forcing a smile. "Winter blues, you know how it is." But it wasn't the winter blues that had her exhausted and preoccupied. It was the hours spent in the freezing forest, carefully cleaning and rebandaging the bear's wound, talking softly about everything and nothing. She told the bear about her life, how she'd inherited the store from her parents, about her dreams of traveling that she'd never quite fulfilled, about the loneliness of being the only single woman her age in White Pine. The bear, for its part, seemed to listen. Those intelligent eyes would follow her as she worked, and sometimes it would make soft sounds in response to her voice. The trust between them grew stronger with each passing day, until Ella found herself sitting closer and closer, eventually able to rest her hand on the bear's thick fur while changing the bandages. On the fourth day, as she approached the clearing, she found the bear had managed to drag itself to a half-sitting position. The sight filled her with both joy and trepidation, joy at seeing the bear's strength returning, and fear of what that strength might mean for their unusual relationship. "Look at you," she said proudly, setting down her supplies. "Getting stronger every day, aren't you?" The bear rumbled softly in response, and Ella could have sworn she saw a glimmer of pride in its eyes. The wound was healing remarkably well, with no sign of infection despite the harsh conditions. Ella had been using every antibiotic ointment she could find in her store's first aid supplies, along with some herbal remedies she'd learned about from her grandmother. On the morning of the 6th day, everything changed. Ella arrived at the clearing just as the sun was beginning to paint the snow-laden branches with golden light. The bear was already standing, testing its injured leg with careful movements. When it saw her, it let out a soft grunt of acknowledgement. Ella stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she'd been both hoping for and dreading. The bear took a few tentative steps, favoring its injured leg, but moving with increasing confidence. Then it did something that would stay with Ella forever. It walked directly toward her. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run, but Ella held her ground, trusting in the connection they'd forged over the past 5 days. The bear stopped just a few feet away, its massive head level with her chest. Slowly, deliberately, it leaned forward and pressed its nose gently against her hand. The touch lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. In that brief contact, Ella felt years of wilderness wisdom being rewritten. This wasn't just an animal thanking its caretaker. This was something far more profound, a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to meet. Then, with a grace that belied its size, the bear turned and began to make its way into the forest. At the edge of the clearing, it stopped and looked back at her one last time. In that final gaze, Ella saw something that brought tears to her eyes, gratitude, pure and unmistakable. As she watched the bear disappear into the forest, Ella felt both elated and strangely empty. The secret that had filled her days was gone, leaving behind a void she wasn't sure how to fill. But she also felt changed, marked by an experience that defied explanation. Walking back to her store that morning, Ella knew she would never see the world quite the same way again. The line between wild and tame, between animal and human, had blurred in ways she never thought possible. But she never imagined that this was just the beginning of an even more extraordinary chapter in her story. The following months brought a gradual shift to White Pine. As winter melted into spring and spring blossomed into summer, stories began to circulate about an unusual grizzly bear in the area. Unlike typical bear sightings that sparked fear and calls to wildlife services, these tales had a different tone. "Saw the strangest thing yesterday," Joe Mitchell, a local logger, announced one morning at Ella's store. "A big grizzly, watching us work from the ridge. Had a noticeable limp, but that's not what was odd. It just observed us, calm as you please. Never seen anything like it." Ella's heart skipped a beat at his words, but she kept her expression neutral as she rang up his purchases. "Maybe it was just curious," she suggested, trying to keep her voice steady. Similar stories accumulated over time. Hikers reported seeing a large bear with a distinctive gait watching them from a distance. Campers spoke of finding their sites undisturbed despite clear bear tracks nearby. Each story mentioned the same details: the limp, the unusual behavior, and most notably, a patch of lighter fur on its left hind leg. Sarah Cooper, a wildlife photographer passing through the area, managed to capture a distant shot of the bear. When she showed the photo to Ella, pride and emotion welled up in her throat. There, clearly visible even in the grainy image, was the healed scar tissue where she had treated the wound, now covered with lighter-colored fur. "It's the most remarkable thing," Sarah had said, zooming in on her camera's display. "This bear seems to have a different relationship with humans. It's like it understands we're not a threat." Ella simply nodded, keeping her secret close to her heart. But privately, each story, each sighting, sent a thrill through her. Her bear hadn't just survived, it was thriving, and somehow, their encounter had changed it in profound ways. The months turned into a year, then two. Ella found herself scanning the tree line more often, hoping for a glimpse of her old friend. She kept a journal of all the reported sightings, mapping them out, trying to understand the bear's movements. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would walk to the edge of the forest, where she'd first heard that pain-filled cry, remembering the trust that had developed in that snowy clearing. Life in White Pine continued its steady rhythm, but Ella felt forever altered by her experience. She became more involved in local wildlife conservation efforts, speaking out against illegal trapping and advocating for better protection of wild spaces. Her store began carrying more eco-friendly products, and she started a small section dedicated to local wildlife education. Then came the morning in June 2024 that would change everything again. It was a day like any other, warm sunshine breaking through scattered clouds, the scent of pine heavy in the air. Ella was arranging a new display of local honey in her store window when she heard the first screams. People were running past her store, some pointing, others pulling out their phones. Ella stepped outside, her heart suddenly racing with an inexplicable anticipation. The crowd had gathered in the street, maintaining a fearful distance from something she couldn't yet see. Then the crowd parted, and Ella's world stopped. There, in the middle of Main Street, was her bear. The massive grizzly moved with the same distinctive gait she remembered, but what made her gasp was what it carried. Clutched carefully in its mouth was a small, limp cub. The bear's eyes found her immediately, as if it had known exactly where she would be. Time seemed to slow as they gazed at each other across the years and across the street, recognizing each other with a certainty that defied explanation. While others backed away in terror, Ella found herself moving forward, drawn by the same inexplicable force that had pulled her into the forest 2 years ago. The bear gently placed its burden on the ground and, with a soft nudge, rolled the injured cub toward her. The message was clear: "I trust you. Help my child as you helped me." The world around Ella seemed to fade away. The gasps of onlookers, the click of phone cameras, the distant wail of approaching sirens, all became background noise to the profound moment unfolding before her. The injured cub lay motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of its tiny chest, while its mother watched with eyes that held both worry and unwavering trust. "Oh my God, Ella, get back!" Someone shouted from the crowd, but their voice seemed to come from very far away. With slow, deliberate movements, Ella approached the cub. The mother bear remained perfectly still, watching intently but showing no signs of aggression. As Ella drew closer, she could see the cub's injury, a deep gash along its side, likely from a fall or an encounter with another predator. "I'm here," Ella whispered, speaking both to the mother and the injured cub. "I'll help." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Ella knelt beside the cub. It was a female, she noticed, probably no more than a few months old. With gentle hands, she examined the wound, conscious of the massive bear standing just feet away. The injury was serious, but not fatal if treated quickly. Looking up at the mother bear, Ella spoke softly. I need to take her to get help. Do you understand?" As if in response, the bear made a soft chuffing sound, the same sound Ella remembered from those cold days 2 years ago. Then, in a display that would soon be viewed millions of times on social media, the bear stepped back, creating space for Ella to lift the cub. "Someone call the Wildlife Rescue Center," Ella called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her body. "Tell them we have an injured cub that needs immediate attention." As she carefully lifted the small bear, cradling it against her chest, the mother bear watched with an intensity that spoke of both concern and faith. The cub weighed no more than 30 pounds, its fur soft and still carrying the sweet smell of youth. Just then, Sheriff Mike Davidson arrived, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm when he saw the grizzly. "Ella, don't move," he called out, his voice tense. "No." Ella's sharp command stopped him. "She's not dangerous. She brought her cub for help. Please, Mike, trust me on this." Something in Ella's voice, or perhaps the extraordinary scene before him, made the sheriff pause. The mother bear had begun to back away, moving with deliberate slowness toward the forest. At the edge of the trees, she stopped and turned, just as she had done 2 years ago in that snowy clearing. Their eyes met one final time, and Ella felt tears running down her cheeks. "I promise," she whispered. "I'll take care of her." The bear disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a scene of amazement and confusion. Within minutes, a team from the Montana Wildlife Rescue Center arrived. As they loaded the cub into their vehicle, Ella finally began to process what had just happened. The crowd had swelled, and phones were everywhere, recording and photographing. Ella knew that by nightfall, this incredible encounter would be making headlines across the country. She could already hear people talking, theorizing, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. "How did it know to bring the cub to you?" someone asked. "Did you know that bear? What made it trust you?" The questions came rapid fire, but Ella barely heard them. Her mind was still with that mother bear, imagining the desperation that must have driven her to bring her injured child into town, the memories that must have guided her straight to the one human she trusted. The days following the remarkable encounter transformed White Pine into the center of an international media storm. News vans lined the previously quiet streets, and reporters from around the world clamored for interviews with Ella. The video of the mother bear bringing her cub went viral, sparking intense debate among wildlife experts and capturing the imagination of millions. At the Montana Wildlife Rescue Center, the injured cub, now named Hope by popular demand, began her recovery. Ella visited daily, watching as the tiny bear grew stronger under expert care. The center's staff were amazed by the cub's unusually calm demeanor around humans, as if she had inherited her mother's extraordinary trust. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the center's lead veterinarian, shared Ella's growing fascination with the case. "In 20 years of working with wildlife, I've never seen anything like this," she confided to Ella one afternoon as they watched Hope explore her enclosure. "This challenges everything we thought we knew about wild animal behavior." Finally, after weeks of dodging reporters and declining interviews, Ella decided to share her full story. She sat down with a respected wildlife documentary filmmaker and recounted everything: the rescue in the snow, the 5 days of healing, and the incredible return 2 years later. The scientific community's reaction was mixed. Some dismissed it as impossible, arguing that bears couldn't possess such complex memory and reasoning abilities. Others saw it as groundbreaking evidence of higher cognitive function in wild animals. Dr. Jane Morris, a renowned expert in animal behavior, flew in from Cambridge University to study the case. "What we're seeing here, Doctor," Morris explained during a presentation at the local community center, "is potentially a paradigm shift in our understanding of wildlife consciousness." This bear not only remembered a specific human who helped her, but she also made the conscious decision to trust this same human with her offspring. The implications are extraordinary. As Hope recovered, Ella found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for wildlife conservation. She spoke at conferences, worked with local authorities to strengthen anti-poaching measures, and helped establish a new wildlife corridor protecting the bear's habitat. The little grocery store became a tourist attraction, with people coming from far and wide hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bear Whisperer of Montana, as some media outlets had dubbed her. Ella used this attention to educate visitors about wildlife conservation and the importance of preserving wild spaces. 3 months after the dramatic rescue, Hope was ready for release. The decision was made to return her to the area where her mother had last been seen, hoping for a reunion. On a crisp September morning, Ella joined the wildlife team for the release. As they opened the transport cage in a quiet clearing, Hope emerged cautiously. She had grown considerably, her wound nothing more than a faint scar beneath her fur. The young bear paused, sniffing the air, then turned to look at Ella one last time before loping into the forest. "Do you think they'll find each other?" one of the wildlife officers asked. Ella smiled, remembering the intelligence and determination in the mother bear's eyes. "I have no doubt," she replied. In the months that followed, trail cameras occasionally captured images of 2 bears moving together through the forest, a large female with a distinctive limp and a younger bear following close behind. The mother seemed to be teaching her cub, showing her the safest paths through human territories and the best places to forage. The story continued to ripple outward, inspiring changes in wildlife management practices and challenging long-held beliefs about the barriers between humans and wild animals. Research teams began studying other cases of wildlife-human interactions, looking for similar evidence of complex reasoning and emotional intelligence in wild animals. 5 years after the remarkable events that changed White Pine forever, Ella stood at the edge of her store's parking lot on a crisp autumn morning. The town had grown, but thoughtfully, new wildlife viewing platforms had been built at safe distances from known bear habitats, and educational centers now offered programs teaching coexistence with wildlife. The Pine Pantry had evolved too. One wall now displayed a beautiful mural depicting the story of the mother bear and Hope, painted by a local artist. A corner of the store had become a mini museum, sharing information about local wildlife and conservation efforts. Children would press their faces against the store windows, hoping to spot the famous bear lady, as they called her. But what gave Ella the most satisfaction was the change in people's attitudes. Where once there had been fear and mistrust of the wild creatures sharing their space, there was now respect and understanding. Illegal traps were a thing of the past, and the community had become fierce protectors of their wild neighbors. On this particular morning, as the sun painted the mountains gold, Ella noticed movement at the forest's edge. Her heart skipped a beat as 3 bears emerged into view, a large female with a familiar gait, a younger bear that could only be Hope, now fully grown, and between them, 2 small cubs tumbling playfully in the early morning light. Hope had become a mother herself. The bears paused at the tree line, and Ella felt tears well up in her eyes as 3 generations of bears regarded her with that same intelligent awareness she'd first encountered in the snowy clearing years ago. The cubs wrestled and played, supervised by their mother and grandmother, showing no fear of the human watching from a respectful distance. The original mother bear, now affectionately known as Grace by the townspeople, made that familiar soft chuffing sound. Hope guided her cubs closer to the forest edge, where they could be better seen but still remain safely within their wild domain. It was as if they were deliberately sharing this moment, this continuation of their extraordinary story. Ella understood then that she wasn't just witnessing a family of bears, she was seeing the future. These cubs would grow up with their mother's inherited wisdom about humans, not as enemies to be feared or prey to be raided, but as potential allies in their shared world. They represented a new kind of coexistence, one born from a single act of compassion in the depths of winter. As the sun rose higher, the bears melted back into their forest home, leaving Ella with a profound sense of completion. The trust that had begun with a trapped bear and a brave decision had rippled outward, touching not just one generation but three, not just one species but two. That evening, as Ella wrote in her journal, now filled with 5 years of bear sightings and encounters, she reflected on how a single moment of courage and compassion could change not just a life, but an entire community's relationship with the wild world around them. Outside her window, the Montana wilderness stretched endless and beautiful, its mysteries still vast and deep. But now, thanks to one remarkable bear and the connection they'd forged, the line between wild and tame, between human spaces and animal domains, had softened into something more nuanced and hopeful. As darkness fell over White Pine, somewhere in the forest, 3 generations of bears made their way through the wilderness, carrying forward a legacy of trust that would continue to shape the relationship between humans and wildlife for years to come. And in her small apartment above the store, Ella smiled, knowing that some stories don't end, they just keep growing, like rings in a tree, marking the seasons of connection between all living things that share this wild and wonderful world.